in retaliation for being cast out of heaven, Satan's going to try and hurt those that are most dear to God. And who is that? The Jews, God's chosen people, because they're the ones who are responsible for bringing forth the Messiah. Yeah. I don't know why Christians, they all the time want to look at the Jews. And Paul tells us in the book of Romans, don't exalt yourself. You need to understand, they're the root. We were just grafted in. Well, for the last month or so, we've been going through the Olivet Discourse verse by verse. And as most of you know, the Olivet Discourse is what Jesus taught concerning the end times. In fact, that's the name of the series, The End Times According to Jesus. Now, because we've been going through the Olivet Discourse verse by verse, you should be familiar with the way that it's laid out, especially in the Gospel of Matthew, because we spent the bulk of our time in Matthew's Gospel. And as I've pointed out many times, Matthew's account of the Olivet Discourse is recorded in chronological order for the most part. In other words, he has arranged the events so that they are laid out in chronological order. In other words, he took what Jesus said about the end times and he kind of rearranged how Jesus said it to make sure that all of the events lined up in chronological order. And that's the reason we chose Matthew's Gospel as we were going through the Olivet Discourse, is because it's laid out in chronological order. In fact, it's laid out in chapter 24 like this. Verses 1 and 2 provide the historical setting. If you remember in the previous chapters, Jesus had been rejected by the leaders of Israel, and they had influenced the people as a whole to reject Jesus. And as a result of that, Jesus said, here's the consequences. The kingdom is going to be taken from you, and it's going to be given to the Gentiles until the time of the Gentiles is fulfilled. But not only that, he said, your house is going to be left desolate. Now, when he said your house, he was referring to the temple, the house of God. It's Israel's house of God, the temple. So when he said your house will be left desolate, it confused the disciples. So you come to Matthew chapter 24 and verse number 1, and they look at the temple and the building and they point them out to Jesus. And in essence, what they're saying is, are you telling us that this is all going to be destroyed? And in verse 2, Jesus says, completely destroyed. Not one stone is going to be left on top of another. Of course, that raised a lot of questions for them. And so verse 3 lists the three questions the disciples asked Jesus. Now, I'm going to give you those three questions, but I want you to understand that this is not the order in which they asked those questions, but I'm giving it to you in the order in which Jesus answered their questions. Number 1, when will the end times begin, and what will be the sign that the end has begun? In other words, how do we know that we're living in the end times? How will we know that? What's the sign? Number 2, when will Jerusalem and the temple be destroyed, and what will be the sign that it's about to happen? And last but not least, number 3, when will you return, and what will be the sign of your coming? This is interesting, because he's telling us, or they're asking, is there going to be a sign to let us know when you're coming? And Jesus is going to answer that. Now, in verses 4 through 6, Jesus provided some general characteristics of the church age, which are not signs. In other words, these things have nothing to do with the end times. They're just a natural byproduct of living in a sinful world. And Jesus didn't want his disciples to jump to the wrong conclusions when they saw these things happening. And yet people do that today. One of the non-signs is wars and rumors of wars. From the time of Jesus, there have been wars and rumors of wars. And today you'll ask people, do you think we're living in times? Oh yes, there's wars and rumors of wars. Well, people, that's a non-sign. There'll be many messiahs or false Christ. There's been that, Jesus was the first one that officially came and said, I am the Jewish Messiah. After him, there's been bukus. Yeah. Those are non-signs. In verses 7 through 8, Jesus gave us the sign of the end of the age. In other words, the sign that lets us know that we're living in the end times. As Christians, we should know, are we living in the end times or not? Because they said, give us a sign so we'll know. And Jesus told us what that sign is. The sign is a world war. Nation shall rise against nation, and kingdom against kingdom. followed by an increase in magnitude and frequency of earthquakes and famine. That confirms the sign. Verses 9 through 28 is a list of events that will occur during the tribulation. This section is broken into two parts. Verses 9 through 14 lists the events that will occur in the first half of the tribulation. Verses 15 through 28 lists the events that will occur in the second half of the tribulation. Verses 29 and 30, which we're going to be looking at this morning, tell us when Christ will return, as well as the sign of his coming. Now listen to me. The second coming is not imminent. Verse 29 tells us when Jesus will return. He doesn't tell us when the rapture will occur. He just says it could happen at any moment. The second coming is not that way. Certain things must transpire before the second coming occurs. That's why the rapture and the second coming are two different events. And if you can't get that, I can't help you. Verse 31 is the regathering of Israel. The Jews will be brought back to the promised land. They will no longer be scattered all over the world. That was part of the curse spoken upon the nation of Israel. Go back to Deuteronomy 28. These curses will follow you. You get to the very end of the chapter and it's like, okay, this is it. When you guys have broken so many times, this is what's going to happen. You're going to be scattered all over the world. But let me tell you, verse 31 tells us there's going to be a regathering of Israel. Verses 32 through 35 is the parable of the fig tree. This lets us know that we're the final generation. In other words, if we live a long, full life, we will see all of these things take place unless we're raptured. If we're raptured, we'll miss the tribulation. Thank God. We won't see asteroids hitting the planets and causing a polar axis shift. We won't see the sun darkened and the moon not shining. We're not going to see those things. But we will live to see the rapture take place. Verse 36 through 42 is about the rapture. Now, this is where Matthew deviates from placing the events in chronological order, but he clearly indicates that he's breaking the pattern. So we know that when he starts talking about the rapture that, it's not at the end, because he lets us know. And you don't really get that unless you can translate it from the original Greek. I'll talk more about that when we get there. Now, last week, we began studying verses 29 and 30, which tells us when Christ will return, as well as the sign of the second coming, but we didn't finish it. We got about halfway through verse number 29. So, if you don't mind, let me give you a quick recap of what we covered. Verse 29 sets the stage for Jesus' return. In other words, he wants us to know, okay, this is what it's going to be like right before Jesus returns. So he's setting the stage for Jesus' return. Because verse 29 tells us three important things. Number one, when Jesus will return. I can tell you exactly when Jesus will return once the tribulation starts. Because verse 29 tells us when Jesus will return. Number two, second important thing, what's it going to be like on this earth right before Jesus Christ returns? Don't we want to know that? Yeah. And number three, what the sign is that signals he's returning. What is the sign? Now, let's read verses 29 and 30, and you'll see what I'm talking about. But immediately after the tribulation of those days, the sun will be darkened, and the moon will not give its light. And the stars will fall from the sky, and the powers of the heavens will be shaken. And then the sign of the Son of Man will appear in the sky. And then all the tribes of the earth will mourn, and they will see the Son of Man coming on the clouds of the sky with power and great glory. Now I want you to notice that Jesus said immediately after the tribulation of those days. The phrase of those days refers to the 2,520 days of the tribulation, also known as the 70th week of Daniel. The first half of the tribulation will be exactly 1,260 days. The second half of the tribulation will be exactly 1,260 days, for a total of 2,520 days. Pastor, how long will the tribulation last? 7 years, prophetical years. 7 years of 360 days. 2,520 days, divided into 2 periods, the first half and the second half. Yeah. So according to Jesus, he will return immediately after the tribulation. Immediately after those 2,520 days. But what will it be like on the earth right before he returns? Well, verse 29 tells us. Notice what it says. But immediately after the tribulation of those days, the sun will be darkened, and the moon will not give its light, and the stars will fall from the sky, and the powers of the heavens will be shaken. Do you see that? The sun will be darkened, the moon won't give its light, the stars will fall from the sky, and the powers of the heavens will be shaken. Now, last week I explained why the sun would be darkened and the moon wouldn't shine. I explained why the asteroids would fall from the sky hitting the earth. And if you weren't here last week, then you need to go back and watch last week's sermon, because I don't have time to review that. Suffice to say, it's the result of the 6th seal being opened in the book of Revelation and the 5th bowl being poured out upon the earth. So, we've already covered the first 3 things that Jesus mentioned, but we didn't get to the last thing, which was the powers of the heavens being shaken. And that's what we're going to cover this morning. At the end of the tribulation, right before Christ returns, the sun will be darkened, the moon won't shine, asteroids will fall from the sky, hitting the earth, causing a polar axis shift, and the powers of the heavens will be shaken. But what does that mean? The powers of the heavens will be shaken. Well, that's what we're going to find out this morning. Who or what are the powers of the heavens, and how will they be shaken? So, let's read verse number 29 again, and I want you to underline the phrase, the powers of the heavens. It says this: but immediately after the tribulation of those days, the sun will be darkened, and the moon will not give its light, the stars will fall from the sky, and the powers of the heavens will be shaken. Now, the word powers is one of the titles used to refer to supernatural forces or beings who try to exert their influence over the destiny and activities of human beings. I didn't highlight that because I'm going to talk about that in a minute. Let me give you an example. Look with me, if you would, in Ephesians chapter 6, verse 12. For we wrestle not against flesh and blood. Oh, some people get out there and wrestle, and some are even foolish enough to get out there and fight. And if we wanted to get out here and wrestle, someone come up here and wrestle me, it'd be easy to take me. But I want you to understand, Paul says this: we don't wrestle against flesh and blood, other humans, but against principalities, against powers, there's that word, against the rulers of the darkness of this world, against spiritual wickedness in heavenly places. Now, principalities, powers, rulers of the darkness, and spiritual wickedness in the heavens are all titles for spiritual forces or beings who try to exert their influence over us. Some of you are more sensitive to spiritual things than others. Believe it or not, I'm not very sensitive to people, but I'm very sensitive to spiritual things. I've walked into certain places and I realize, ooh, there's something demonic going on here. I don't know what it is. Years and years ago, I came in and we had a person that was at our church that played in the band, and I walked in and I knew something was wrong. It went on for several weeks, so I said, God, what's the deal? And he told me, he said, he's smoking pot. So I confronted him after the service. And he said, yeah, I have been. I'm sorry. And I want you to understand something. The Holy Spirit's a gentleman. He's not going to tell off on you until it gets to a point. And then he tells you that judgment begins in the house of the Lord. Then things are revealed. You know, dirty laundry in the church eventually gets aired. We've seen that with pastors falling, right? They hide it for a while, but eventually it comes out. That's because God loves us. He gives us a chance to repent in private, but when we don't. But my point is I'm getting off. I'm sensitive to those spiritual things. But I want you to understand these spiritual beings are trying to exert influence over us. And some of you are being oppressed and don't even know it. So, the powers of the heavens that Jesus is referring to is Satan and his demonic followers. If you're taking notes, write that down. The powers of the heavens that Jesus is referring to is Satan and his demonic followers. Now, in verse number 29, Jesus tells us that the powers of the heavens will be shaken. Look at verse 29 again. But immediately after the tribulation of those days, the sun will be darkened, and the moon will not give its light, and the stars will fall from the sky, and the powers of heavens will be shaken. In other words, Satan and his demonic forces will be shaken. But what in the world does that mean? Well, underline the word shaken and let's find out. The word shaken is translated from the Greek word sauo. And it means to overthrow or to cast down from a previous position or state. So what Jesus is saying is that Satan and his followers are going to be cast down from heaven. Let me say that again. What Jesus is saying is that Satan and his followers are going to be cast down from heaven. In fact, during the tribulation, there's going to be a war in heaven between Michael and his angels and Satan and his angels. And Satan is going to be defeated and cast down from heaven. And this is what Jesus is talking about. Now again, Jesus is describing in layman's terms the very same thing that John described in the book of Revelation. John goes into much more detail than Jesus does, but Jesus is describing the very same thing. Jesus doesn't want to get off in little details. He's just giving you a brief synopsis. Here's what's going to happen during the tribulation. Here's what's going to happen when Jesus returns. This is what's going to take place when I get here. Yeah. John goes into a lot more detail. But I want you to understand in the Olivet Discourse, Jesus is describing the very same thing that John is describing in much more detail in the book of Revelation. Now turn to the book of Revelation chapter 12, verses 7 and 8, and I'll show you what I'm talking about. And there was a war in heaven. Michael and his angels fought against the dragon, and the dragon fought and his angels, and prevailed not, neither was their place found any more in heaven. They had a place in heaven? Yeah. Now, how many of you have been taught that Satan was cast out of heaven and banished when he rebelled against God? Well, actually, that's not true. But this is the scripture that pastors use to support that belief. The only problem with that is this verse isn't talking about something that's already happened. It's talking about something that's going to happen in the future. Yeah. In fact, it's going to happen in the middle of the tribulation, right after the abomination of desolation takes place. You see, even though Lucifer has fallen from his lofty position, he still has access to the throne of God. And let me prove it to you. Turn to Job chapter 1, verses 6 and 7. One day the angels came to present themselves before the Lord. Notice that the word Lord is in all caps. Who is that? Yahweh! By now you ought to know that. If you're watching online, you haven't been at our church for a long time, whenever you see the word Lord in all caps, it's referring to Yahweh. So one day the angels came to present themselves before the Lord. And Satan also came with them. The Lord said to Satan, "Where have you come from?" Satan answered the Lord, "From roaming through the earth and going back and forth in it." Now, obviously, the book of Job happened after Satan's rebellion, which tells us that Satan has access to God's throne. Yes, he roams the earth like a lion seeking whom he may devour, but he also has access to the throne of God, access to heaven. Turn to Job chapter 2, verses 1 and 2, and let's look at another example. On another day, not the same day, The angels came to present themselves before the Lord, and Satan also came with them to present himself before him. And the Lord said to Satan, "Where have you come from?" Satan answered the Lord, "From roaming through the earth and going back and forth in it." Yeah. So Satan has the ability to roam this earth, but he also has the ability to go up to heaven, to come before the Lord. So it's pretty obvious from these two passages of Scripture that Satan has access to God's throne. He has access to heaven. But what does he do there? Well, if you read the first few chapters of Job, you'll find that Satan was accusing Job of serving God with the wrong motive. He only serves you because you bless him. That was his accusation. And people, that's what Satan does when he comes before God. He makes accusations against us. That's why he's referred to as the accuser of the brethren. He makes accusations about us or against us to God. So, even though Satan lost his position when he rebelled against God, he still has access to heaven. Excuse me. Yes, I'm trying to keep it from this side when I cough. So, again, even though Satan has lost his position when he rebelled against God, he still has access to heaven, and so do some of his angels. Look at Ephesians chapter 6, verse 12. We're still in Ephesians chapter 6, where, if you remember in the earlier verse, he mentioned all these things. And then in verse number 12, he says this: "For our struggle is not against flesh and blood, but against the rulers, against the authorities, against the powers of this dark world, and against the spiritual forces of evil in the heavenly realms." According to Paul, there are spiritual forces of evil in the heavenly realms. But they won't be there forever. There is coming a day when Satan and his angels are going to be kicked out of heaven for good. And he will no longer have access to God. He'll no longer have access to heaven. And people, that's what Revelation chapter 12, verses 7 and 8 is all about. You see, the demise of Satan happens in 3 steps. The first step is when he's banished from heaven. You'll find that in Revelation chapter 12, verses 7 through 8. The second step is when he's chained in the bottomless pit during the millennium. That's in Revelation chapter 20, verses 1 through 3. And the last and final step is when he's thrown into the lake of fire. You'll find that in Revelation chapter 20, verse number 10. So, here's what I'm telling you. At the midpoint of the tribulation, when the 2 witnesses are murdered, the Antichrist makes his move. He enters into the temple of God, proclaiming himself to be God, and he demands to be worshiped. At that time, Satan makes his move. And there is a great battle in heaven. Satan is not only defeated, but he's banished from heaven. It's over. No more access to heaven. No more accusations against the brethren. Instead, Satan is cast down to the earth for good. Now, look at verse 9 in Revelation chapter 12. We're still in Revelation chapter 12. We're going to stay in there, and we're going to read about this battle and the ramifications of it. Notice what it says. "And the great dragon was cast out, that old serpent, called the devil and Satan, which deceiveth the whole world. He was cast out into the earth, and his angels were cast out with him." Now, the phrase "cast out" is used 3 times in this verse. Why? Why? Well, the reason it's used 3 times is to emphasize the decisiveness of the battle. Satan and his angels were expelled from heaven permanently. They were cast out once, cast out 2, cast out. I want you to know, this is decisive. He's no longer going to have access to heaven. Now, to avoid any mistaken identity of who was cast out of heaven, John identifies Satan in 5 different ways in verse 9. In this one verse, he refers to Lucifer in 5 different ways. First of all, he's referred to as the dragon, which speaks of his wickedness and his cruelty. You see, dragons were thought of as being cold, cruel animals that kill for sport. Think of crocodiles, and you get the picture. Secondly, he's referred to as that old serpent. This is meant to remind us of Adam and Eve's fall in the Garden of Eden. It was the serpent who tempted Adam and Eve to sin. He's also called as it says in verse 9, the devil and Satan. The word devil is translated from the Greek compound word diabolos. It's made up of two words, the prefix dia, which means through, and balo, which means to throw. When you combine those two words, it literally means to continually throw at something until you break through. How many of you ever said, it's just one thing after another? The refrigerator broke down. They sent us home from work so we might not get paid. The car needs new tires and the kids are sick. And you just want to give up. Why are things just constantly thrown at you? Because that's Satan's method of attack. That's why he's called the devil. Devil's not his name, it's a descriptor. It tells you his method of attacking you. Satan means adversary. You see, Satan hates God and he wants to hurt God. So the best way that he can hurt God is to hurt those whom God loves. If God or Satan can hurt you, he hurts God. There's no other way he can hurt him. And that's why he wants to hurt you. That's why he wants evil in this world. This is why he wants bad things to happen, because it hurts God. He's Satan. He's the adversary. And last but not least, he's referred to as the one who deceives the world. He's the master of deception with the uncanny ability to mislead people. And once he misleads people, he turns right around and accuses them. This is wonderful. I want you to get this picture. It doesn't say it in the Bible, but when you read through the Bible, you know exactly what Satan did. He appears to Adam and Eve in the garden, and he says, did God really say that if you eat this, you would die? Do you think you'll really die? Now I'm paraphrasing. God knows that when you eat of it, you will become like him, knowing the difference between good and evil. God just doesn't want you to be like him. Surely you won't die. Eve looks at it. She's tempted. She takes a bite of it. Adam's watching the whole time. Doesn't stop her. He finally says, is it good? And she says, yeah. He looked around and God didn't send lightning and hit her. So he took a bite. Now, immediately what do you think happened? Well, I can tell you what happened, even though it's not recorded in the book of Genesis. Satan immediately goes to God and says, God, do you see what they did? You specifically told them not to eat of that, and they did. You said they'll die. Now, they didn't physically die the day they ate of it. They spiritually died, which led to physical death. Death simply means separation from God. You're separated by your sin. And until you accept Jesus Christ, you're separated from God, even though he loves you. Once you accept Jesus Christ and your sins are forgiven, you're reconciled to God and no longer separated. That's why even though you might physically die, you still live. That's good teaching, Pastor Allen. But I want you to understand something. Satan's trying to get you to flirt if you're married. He's trying to get you to look at porn. He's trying to get you to party. He's trying to get you to do all these things. And as soon as you do, he turns right around and goes, look at them, God. Yeah. Yeah. He misleads you, and then he turns right around and accuses you. Yep. Now look at verses 10 and 11 in Revelation chapter 12. And I heard a loud voice saying in heaven, now has come salvation and strength and the kingdom of our God and the power of his Messiah, Christ. For the accuser of our brethren is cast down, which accused them before our God day and night. How could he accuse them before God unless he has access to heaven? Day and night. And they overcame him by the blood of the Lamb. The way that we overcame being accused. Because now, those accusations, yeah, well, I just want you to know, those sins are paid for. They overcame him by the blood of the Lamb, by the word of their testimony. Jesus is Lord. That's what he means, word of their testimony. And they led not their lives unto death. Now, once Satan is cast down from heaven, heaven celebrates. This victory is just one more step towards the establishment of God's kingdom here upon the earth. But things are really going to get tough for those on the earth, especially for the Jews and those who accept Christ after the rapture. Look at verse 12. Therefore rejoice, ye heavens, and ye that dwell in them. Woe to the inhabitants of the earth and of the sea, for the devil is come down unto you having great wrath, because he knows now that he has but a short time. Now I want you to underline that word therefore. Therefore is translated from the Greek phrase diatato, which means because of this. Because of this, rejoice heaven and you that dwell in heaven. Now, what's he talking about because of this? Because of what? Because Satan has been kicked out of heaven permanently. Because of this, rejoice heaven and those that dwell in heaven. But woe to the inhabitants of the earth. In other words, it's a good thing for those in heaven, but it's a bad thing for those on the earth. Why? Because Satan's really ticked off now that he's been kicked out of heaven. And he knows he only has a short time. How short? 3.5 years. Yeah. How do you know that? Well, let's keep reading. Look at verses 13 and 14. And when the dragon saw that he was cast into the earth, no longer has access to heaven, he persecuted the woman, Israel, which brought forth the man-child, Jesus. Jesus was a Jew. He's the Jewish Messiah. It was the chosen people that brought forth the Messiah. They rejected him, but they're the ones who brought him forth. They'll repent at the end of the tribulation, recognize that he's the Messiah. They're still his chosen people. But let's keep reading. Verse 14. And to the woman were given 2 wings of a great eagle, that she might fly into the wilderness, into her place where she is nourished for a time and times and half a time from the face of the serpent. So, in retaliation for being cast out of heaven, Satan's going to try and hurt those that are most dear to God. And who is that? The Jews, God's chosen people. Because they're the ones who are responsible for bringing forth the Messiah. Yeah. You know, I don't know why Christians, they all the time want to look at the Jews. And Paul tells us in the book of Romans, don't exalt yourself. You need to understand, they're the root. We were just grafted in. Yeah, anyways, I'm getting off. But I want you to understand, Satan hates them above everyone else. So now Satan is going to persecute the woman with a new vengeance. The only problem is the Jews are going to flee into the wilderness when they see the abomination of desolation take place. So they're going to be one step ahead of Satan. Look at verse 14. And to the woman were given 2 wings of a great eagle, that she might fly into the wilderness, into her place where she is nourished, in other words, protected for a time and times and half a time from the face of the serpent. Now, some scholars believe that the eagle with 2 wings is symbolic, and it's talking about airplanes. But I don't believe that, and let me tell you why. This is the same terminology that's used in the Old Testament when Israel was delivered from Egypt. Look at Exodus chapter 19, verse number 4. Remember, Exodus means deliverance. You're exiting. You're coming out. So here's what it says. You yourselves have seen what I did to Egypt and how I carried you on eagle's wings and brought you to myself. So God is talking about, okay, when I brought you out of Egypt, you saw what I did to Egypt and how I carried you on eagle's wings. Now look at Deuteronomy chapter 32, verses 9 through 12. For the Lord's portion is his people. Jacob is the lot of his inheritance. He found him in a desert land and in the waste howling wilderness. He led him about, he instructed him, he kept him as the apple of his eye. As an eagle stirreth up her nest, fluttereth over her young, spreadeth abroad her wings, taketh them, beareth them on her wings. So the Lord alone did lead him, and there was no strange God with him. So this is basically a figure of speech that means God will deliver them. And because Petra is only 45 miles south of the Dead Sea, they'll be able to get there quickly, and they don't need an airplane. In fact, it'd take longer to get in the airplane, take off, fly there and land than it would be just to flee. Remember, Jesus told those in Judea to flee, not those in other nations. Look at Matthew chapter 24, verses 15 through 16. This is part of the Olivet Discourse. He didn't tell every Jew to flee. He said the Jews in Judea and Jerusalem. Notice what it says. When you therefore see the abomination of desolation spoken of by Daniel the prophet stand in the holy place, then let them which be in Judea flee into the mountains. Now, how long will Israel have to remain in the wilderness? Well, look at verse 14 again. And to the woman were given 2 wings of a great eagle, that she might fly into the wilderness into her place, where she is nourished for a time, and times, and half a time from the face of the serpent. A time, which is 1, and times, which is 2. This is not plural, this is a dual. A dual means more than 1, but not more than 2. So what does it mean? 2. And half a time, which equals 3.5 years. So when the abomination of desolation occurs at the midpoint of the tribulation, those in Judea flee to Petra, and they remain in the wilderness for 3.5 years, which is exactly how long the last half of the tribulation is. This is further proof that Satan is not kicked out of heaven until the middle of the tribulation. In fact, just go back and read chapter 12 in Revelation in context, and you'll see what I'm talking about. You'll see that when Satan gets kicked out of heaven, he turns his great wrath on the woman, which is Israel. But Israel flees to the wilderness and is protected by God for 3.5 years. That tells us that the battle in verses 7 and 8, where Satan gets kicked out of heaven, doesn't happen until the middle of the tribulation. But as I said, Israel is one step ahead of Satan. And the reason they're one step ahead of Satan is because when they see the abomination of desolation take place, they flee to the wilderness immediately. I'm not going to read it, but you can go back in Matthew chapter 24, verses 15 through 18. Remember, this is the events that's going to occur at the beginning or during the second half of tribulation. At the very beginning of that's the abomination of desolation. And Jesus tells them, when you see it, you flee. But he also says this, pray that it does not occur on the Sabbath. Why? Because the Orthodox Jews cannot travel on the Sabbath, at least not for any long distance, because that would be considered to be work. That's why the whole travel industry, public transportation, is shut down on the Sabbath in Israel. So, those are the conditions on the earth at the end of the tribulation right before Christ returns. The sun is darkened. The moon doesn't shine. Asteroids have fallen from the sky, hitting the earth, causing a polar axis shift. And Satan has been pouring out his wrath upon the Jews and Christians because he's been cast out of heaven. And at this point, it looks like all is lost. And there's no hope for mankind, and not even for our planet. And it's at this moment that the sign of Jesus coming appears in the sky. Look back at verse number 30 in Matthew chapter 24. This is part of the Olivet Discourse. And then the sign of the Son of Man will appear in the sky. And then all the tribes of the earth will mourn, and they will see the Son of Man coming on the clouds of the sky with power and great glory. Now there are 2 things that I want you to notice in verse 30. First, the sign will appear in the sky, not on the earth, in the sky. And secondly, they will see the Son of Man in the sky coming with power and great glory. Truth is found in the details, people. Not just glory, but great glory. They will see the Son of Man coming in the clouds in great glory. Paulus doxa, which refers to the Shekinah glory of God. Now, does everyone know what the word Shekinah means? How many of you have heard of the word Shekinah? None of you? Never heard of Shekinah glory? Oh my gosh. Well, anyways, I'm going to assume that none of you know what Shekinah means. The word Shekinah is not found in the Bible. But the concept of the Shekinah glory is found in the Bible. You see, the term Shekinah was actually coined by rabbis before the time of Jesus. And it refers to the glory that's manifested in the divine presence of God. Or I should say it emanates from the divine presence of God. In fact, it's too awesome and powerful to be seen completely by man while he's a human. So it's usually muted. In the wilderness, it was a cloud by day and a pillar of fire by night. When Moses wanted to see God's glory, God hid him in the cleft of the rock. And he told him, he said, you can't see my face and live. No man can do that. No human can do that. That's why in the Old Testament, when the high priest went into the Holy of Holies, he actually had to take in incense. There had to be some type of barrier between him and God, or he would die. So he tells Moses, you want to see my glory? Well, you can't see it all, but you'll get a peek at it. So he hides him in the cleft of the rock, and he says, stay right here, and I'm going to pass by. And when he passes by, he takes his hand, and he places it over where he can't see him as he comes. He's in this cleft of the rock. He can only look straight out. All of a sudden, he sees this hand come, and the hand blocks his vision. And God passes by, and as he passes by, he takes his hand off so he can see his backside. He can see a partial of God's glory. Now, it's not just glory, it's great glory. Glory does not mean the presence of God. Everyone has glory. I won't get into that, but basically means the pinnacle of perfection. When God created man, the glory of man is when he becomes what God created him to be. We talk about glorified bodies. One day we'll have glorified bodies. That means your body will be everything that God created to be. It will be the pinnacle of perfection. Yeah. Everyone with me? But God's glory is unlike anyone else's. Because each thing the sun has its own glory, the stars has its own glory, different animals have glory. It's all different based upon what God created them to be. But God is not a created being. His glory is unbelievable. That's why they coined this term Shekinah glory. And when you see the phrase great glory, it refers to the Shekinah glory. So when Jesus returns, he will come with great glory. In other words, his divine presence in the sky will be emanating the Shekinah glory of God. And when he first appears in the clouds, you won't see him because the Shekinah glory will be like lightning in the sky. Remember what Jesus said in Matthew chapter 24, verses 27. Remember from verses 15 through 28, these are the events that are going to occur in the second half. But as he's talking in that, in verse number 27, he gets ahead of himself, Jesus does, and he says this in verse 27. For as the lightning flashes in the east and shines to the west, so it will be when the Son of Man comes. In other words, when Jesus appears, the Shekinah glory will be like lightning. But unlike lightning, it won't disappear. In other words, it will illuminate the sky like a lightning bolt, but it will maintain its brilliancy. The light won't dissipate. And as everyone's eyes becomes accustomed to the brilliancy, they'll see the coming Son of Man. What a sight. So, let me set the stage for you. I want you to get a picture of this. At the very end of the tribulation, the sun is darkened, the moon won't shine. Asteroids have fallen from the sky, hitting the earth and causing this polar axis shift. The earth has wobbled and fallen. The heavens have rolled like a scroll. Can you picture that? And then when all seems lost, even our planet, a lightning bolt flashes in the east and shines even unto the west. In other words, all around the earth. But it doesn't lose its brilliancy. Instead, it maintains its brilliancy because it's the great glory. It's the Shekinah glory. And as people look to the sky and their eyes become accustomed to the intense illumination, then they see the Son of Man coming on the clouds. Can you picture that? It will be the most climactic and most dramatic event in the history of mankind. It's the return of Jesus, the Christ, the Son of the living God, in all of his glory. So what is the sign in the sky signaling Jesus' return? First, the Shekinah glory flashing across the globe and filling the sky with its brilliancy. And then Jesus appears coming in the clouds. He is the focal point of the Shekinah glory. People, that's the sign, all of that. It's the lightning. It's the illumination. It's the brilliancy. And it's Jesus. in the clouds. That's the sign. You won't see the sign until he's ready to come. And the sign is his great glory in him. Now, what's the world's response to the sign? Well, look at verse 30 and let's find out. And then the sign of the Son of Man will appear in the sky, and then all the tribes of the earth will mourn. Do you see that? Everyone on the earth will mourn. The word mourn is translated from the Greek word kopto. In this context, it means to wail. In other words, they will wail because they're in the presence of God the Son. Those who refuse to take the mark of the beast will wail because their deliverer has come, and emotions will override them because they have endured for 7 years. They missed the rapture, but they realized that Jesus is Lord, so they endured. They endured the famines and the earthquakes. They endured the polar axis shifts. They thought they couldn't endure anymore, and there he is. And they will wail because their emotions will overcome them. But those who've taken the mark of the beast will wail because their end has come and they're in the divine presence of God the Son. They were foolish and they made foolish choices, and now they know just how foolish they are because they're in the presence of God, and they realize they're damned for all eternity. The great white throne judgment will be a time of wailing, kopto, when people realize they're damned. So when Jesus appears, it looks hopeless. It's not hopeless for those who've endured to the end, but it's hopeless for those who've taken the mark and didn't endure. You know, talk about foolish people. If you were to ask Christians, do you want Jesus to return now, right now? Most Christians would say no. And you want to know why? Because they're enjoying the pleasures of the sinfulness of this world. Yeah. I didn't get saved till I was 20. Grew up in a Christian home, went to church all my life, accepted Jesus as my fire escape, said the sinner's prayer, walked down the aisle, was baptized, but I wasn't saved because Jesus wasn't Lord. I didn't want to make Jesus Lord. I was afraid if I became a Christian, I'd miss out on everything. And you know, there's so many Christians this way about Jesus' return. Now let me show you how foolish this is. How many of you have someone in your family that needs a healing? How many of you have something that's happening in your family where you need a miracle? How many of you need something where God just needs to show up and do something big? Okay. When Jesus returns, all the healings will be there. All the miracles will be there. Everyone will be prosperous. Everything will be set right. No more death. No more destruction. Now, don't get me wrong. You'll still have those who made it through the tribulation that are humans. Therefore, they have the Adamic nature. And some will die during the millennium, but it will be rare. It's be those who need a judgment, and everyone will know, Isaiah tells us. But here's what's interesting. Here's how most Christians feel. They so want Jesus to heal this person in their family, but they don't want Jesus to come. They just want him to heal so they can continue to live in the sinful world. They need this miracle, so they want God to do this miracle, but they don't want Jesus to return. Because if Jesus returns, I can't enjoy the sinful pleasures of this world. I still want to do this or that. They need God to move in a mighty way here, but they don't want Jesus to return. Do you see how foolish that is? People, when Jesus returns, everything that you want that's righteous and holy and of joy is going to be there. No more sickness, no more disease, no more deformities. No more fighting over whether to take the vaccine or don't take the vaccine. No. But we are so foolish because we want God to step in, but don't step into the world at your coming. I don't know if it's my age or because of what I do. I see all the horrible things. I pray every day for you all. I pray for those who have cancer. I pray for those who their husband or their wife's left them. I pray for those whose children are on drugs. I pray for all of these different things. And all I want is for Jesus to come back. Because then I don't have all those. But I talk to people and they don't want Jesus to come back because they like living in this sinful world. They just want him to step in and fix these things. I don't know what's wrong with this. But let me tell you, I want Jesus to come back. I'm tired of people dying. I'm tired of sickness and disease. I'm tired of addictions and evil running rampant. I'm tired of all these things. I'm going to be raptured. But if I wasn't, I'd be one of those wailing when I saw Jesus for how foolish I was that I didn't want Jesus. Some of you are so foolish you've not made Jesus Lord of your life, and you will miss the rapture. Trust me, if you endure to the end of that 7 years tribulation, when Jesus returns, if you've accepted him, if you've refused to take the mark, you will wail. You will mourn that you weren't wise enough to accept Jesus before the rapture.